Hey, Lee here, helping you become a better plant parent. Let's answer some community questions and help people along their plant journey. The first question comes from Instagram, and it says, I have a soil stick to tell me when the plant is dry, and I water roughly every other day, but never a full watering. Or I bring the planter outside and do a full soak. I let it drip out, then bring it in after about 10 minutes later. I do that every 4 to 5 weeks. I don't pull it out of its decorative pot, and it does have a drain hole at the bottom of the planter. Now, I chose this question because I've spoken to a good number of people who use sort of a similar watering technique as this. They water their plant just a little bit every day or every few days, and then finally they do one big soak of their plant. So if you're using this watering technique, you can actually over and underwater the same plant simultaneously. It's really interesting. So what I did want to show you is on this Monstera as an example, what you can actually do is if you're using a half a cup or a cup of water just to water your plant every 2 to 3 days, you're actually only watering this top portion of the roots, and everything below, assuming water's not coming and dripping through, is actually dry. If you want your plant to be overall healthy, the entire root system needs to have access to that water. Your plant just can't use the roots at the top to suck up all the nutrients effectively. Your whole plant does need to have an extensive root system, and it has to have access to water so that the plant can actually soak up the nutrients that are inside the soil. So you don't really want to be watering your plant like that every 2 days with a minimal amount of water. You may want to choose something like every 5 to 10 days and then do a thorough watering every single time. And the interesting thing with that is you can't always, or you shouldn't always do a thorough watering. You really need to deeply understand what your root system looks like. If you're thinking about a plant that you've just repotted and it doesn't have an extensive root system, you may not want to be doing a full and complete soak of that plant, because if you're doing a full soak, you're not necessarily checking how frequently the soil dries out, and you're just doing it on a 7-day schedule because someone told you to water this plant every 7 days. You could end up overwatering your plant. But if you do have a fairly extensive root system and your plant can access all of the water that's in the pot without overwatering, then yes, you can do a full soak every single time. I'm just repotting some Hoya compacta that I got from a local nursery. They were a really great price. They were only about $9 each. So I figured that I'd buy 3, put them all in a terracotta pot together, and start growing some more Hoyas. I only have one Hoya so far, and that's a Hoya carrii, and it just looks absolutely like garbage. I'll probably put some footage in. So with these Hoya compactas, they do often come with a lot of pests. Mealybugs are one of the worst criminals for this type of plant, and looking in closely, I do see some spider webs. So I do have some Safer's End-All Miticide, and I'm just gonna give them a quick spray before I pot them all together. So if you or someone you know is using a similar watering technique to this, I really recommend that you scale back on the frequency of which you're watering, and then think about making sure that your entire root system has access to all that water. Make sure it gets fully soaked. You don't need to necessarily put it under the sink or under a hose for 10 minutes. As long as you see water coming out of the bottom, that means that the plant can't hold any more moisture, and then your plant should be fine. The next question is, when do you need to start wrapping a Monstera? I just bought one and I want to be a good mom. That really does depend on what your stake actually looks like. If you're using a moss pole, if you're using a bamboo pole, it really depends on how much space that stake takes up inside the pot. For me, I usually just use bamboo stakes if I'm dealing with smaller plants. So with that, I can actually just repot and then put in the stake as early as possible, as late as possible. It doesn't really matter too much, but it does matter what size your stake is. So if you're getting something like one of those stackable moss poles off of Amazon, you may want to repot at your earliest convenience, just because the more extensive your root system gets, the harder it is for you to put your stake inside that pot. So if you are getting something that has a thick base, I would repot and get a moss pole going as early as possible. But if you do have a small plant like a Monstera, a smaller Monstera, you can really just wait, because that plant can support its own weight for a pretty long time. Once it starts growing and it starts flopping over and you want to control the direction of the growth, that's when you want to start thinking about when you should put a moss pole inside the pot. And for this Hoya, I really want to have it growing on my plant shelf. I think as it grows out, it'll look pretty good. I'm a little bit concerned about propagating Hoyas. I don't have a lot of experience with them, but I think once this gets bigger, I think maybe 5 to 6 different plants in a single pot would look pretty good. But then I would have to start upgrading to a much larger size. And I know that Hoyas generally like to be a little bit more on the dry side, so because I am keeping this a little bit closer to a window, I'm gonna use terracotta, and I'll water just a tiny bit more frequently than I would with a Hoya inside a plastic pot. I've also had situations where I've had a tiny cutting inside a pot with a 5 or 6 foot bamboo pole, and for me that's just because I like to plan ahead with certain plants. I know the plants that are going to do well in my space, so if I'm growing something like a pothos or a Monstera adansonii and I really want it to mature and have larger leaves, I do plan very far ahead, and I make sure that as the plant grows, I'm always tying it to the bamboo pole so that it can start to get larger leaves. There also seems to be an extreme sense of urgency when creators in this space suggest something that you should or could do with your plants. I want to make sure that my content doesn't give you a sense of urgency that you need to do this now or your plant will suffer. And I'm really striving to reframe my language when I say you need to do something, because when I say you need to do something, of course there's so many different ways that you can grow plants. You don't need to do anything if one method is already working for you. These are just suggestions, and I don't want to make it seem that you need to do this now or your plant is going to suffer. I think if you have a healthy plant, there is absolutely no urgency for you to do anything different or change anything. But if your plant is suffering, if it's something like a pest infection, then maybe only then might there be an actual sense of urgency where you need to do something right away, or else your plant is going to suffer and you'll have to get a new one. The next question says, my small pilea lost all of its leaves. Is there any chance that I can save it? Yes and no. You can save almost any plant, but if you don't know what is the cause of your plant suffering in the first place, then there's really no point in trying to save it, because if your environment is exactly the same, then you're going to have exactly the same results. So I think the most important thing when you're thinking about rescuing a suffering plant is diagnosing the problem first. You really have to understand what are the environmental issues that have caused your plant to suffer. If you don't know what's wrong, then you're going to repeat the same mistakes over and over. So many pileas are very different and have different techniques on how you might care for or rescue another one. This question was specifically about the Pilea peperomoides. So what's interesting about this plant is that the pups come out of the stem of the plant. So if you still have a healthy stem, so theoretically you could cut up that stem and then put those stem pieces back into soil or back into moss and then regrow the plant that way. But again, if you're having issues with that specific plant, make sure you know what those issues are remedy them, and then you'll be able to grow a new one. One of my favorite plant YouTubers, Tech Plant, has some really great stuff on how to propagate a pilea peperomoides in a bunch of different ways. He does really great experiments to see which is the most effective method. So I'll make sure to link some of those videos down in the description as well. This last plant that I'm potting up is my Hoya pupicalix, and I did get it at the same nursery, and I don't consider myself a Hoya collector, but I did recently see the price of one Hoya and it was $230. It didn't look particularly different than this Hoya right here, but I'm sure it was very uncommon, extremely sought after, and that demand is what drives the price up in the plant community. So if you are a Hoya collector, just be very careful that you're not overspending, especially since there's thousands of different Hoyas that you can be getting. If you have any plant questions, I encourage you to post them in the comments below, and I encourage members of the community to go try to show kindness and answer some of those questions so we can all become better houseplant parents together. Like this video if it was helpful, and consider subscribing. I'll see you next time.